Welcome to another episode of the Sparkles of Gold Astrology Manifesto podcast. I'm Nicolas Polimenakos, aka Sparkles of Gold. Today we have a special episode because we have two special guests with us today. Our first guest,
Bradley Narragon from bradleynarragon.com.
And I'm Gray Crawford at graycrawford.net, spelled Gray, crawford.net.
And I'm Sparkles of Gold from sparklesofgold.com. Today, we are going to focus on the lunar eclipse that happens at 26 degrees Scorpio. And it just so happens that we started this podcast at Monday, May 9th around 9:02 p.m. We're here on the West Coast, and we're looking at the ascendant of where we are and what degree is the ascendant at.
It's basically 25, 26 Scorpio.
So we're pretty much at the degree of this lunar total eclipse that happens on May 15th, 9:14 p.m. Pacific time. And for many in other parts of the world, it happens on May 16th. We didn't plan it this way, actually. We actually made a mistake and we started over again, and here we are. So it's meant to be, as it always is. So we're going to focus on this particular lunation and eclipse and some other side transits and aspects that are connected to all this. So who wants to jump in first?
Well, I'll jump in. I'm jumping in a different spot because, so this is something that I've always thought about is sometimes I've noticed that when full moons, and full moon eclipses in this case, aren't that intense, but I do think this chart is intense. But sometimes when they're not, sometimes they are intense because you always got to remember what was seeded at the new moon because that's what's come into climax here. And the new moon was conjunct Uranus, so we just had a big shakeup. We've had, the stories are coming in, whether you know someone, whether it happened to you, there's been a lot of big shifts and changes. We're not settled from that. The energy is still building as we approach this full moon eclipse.
Yeah, and this is, in fact, a total lunar eclipse. So this is the classic blood red moon that'll be in our region of the world. It's going to be rising over the horizon as a total eclipse moon. But not only is it a total lunar eclipse, which means in this case the moon is within only like 3 degrees of its own south node. It's a south node eclipse in Scorpio. Scorpio is the fall of the moon. Perhaps the most intense moon is Scorpio, just for feeling the greatest depth of everything. We know in the collective of everything that's been going on, there's been lots of grief to be released, which is something that we think about with a south node lunar eclipse. Typically with the moon being eclipsed at the south node, there's something that's being released, emptied, in some cases harvested, something perhaps sacrificed in some way. And with the sun over at the north node, though, there's also something with that process. There's also this influx. There's this growth happening. There's something new coming in. It's very Uranian, like Bradley was just saying, because the north node and the sun were with Uranus. But then this eclipse is actually very tightly squaring Saturn. For astrologers that looked ahead at the year, we all saw this as most likely being a big pressure point. And of course, at the beginning of the year, we didn't know what would be happening at this point. I know when I was looking ahead at the year based on the Aries ingress and what was happening at the end of last year, abortion was definitely a big concern, and that something could happen with abortion and Roe versus Wade being overturned. And what we just had, of course, was this very Uranian kind of unprecedented leak, giving people sort of a heads up about what's brewing with that. We also have a war happening in Ukraine. So all those stories are definitely in the collective right now. And there's a lot of grief, a lot of people terrified, scared, in a rage, angry, upset. But there's also, as we'll talk about, there's other parts about this chart and this eclipse where I think there is a sign of, how do we really take action towards the world we really want to create together.
It's interesting that you brought up the take action part here, because we are talking about this eclipse that's happening on May 15th, but it's several days before here on May 10th, where we have two interesting astrological events. And one is Mercury in Gemini stationing retrograde. And when you said the word action to me, the other event is Jupiter ingress into Aries. And so, Gray, when you say action to me, that's what I feel and see. And we also know that down the line here later in the month, we're going to have a Mars and Aries ingress, so on and so forth. So I understand what you're saying about the action. And back to what we were talking about, Uranus being involved in this eclipse, and the new moon eclipse that happened at 10 degrees Taurus the 2 weeks before. Uranus is involved. Uranus is another bringer of change and action in a sense too. This is definitely a month of transitions. If we're going to talk about things on the political level too, I will also add that what is happening to the economy and the fear and threats of inflation. We've seen the stock market have several huge dips here in the last week and a half. It's also affected the cryptocurrency markets. So we're talking about a lot of uneasiness and a lot of tension that's been built up. What I see is this inevitable shifting. There's no way out. Something has to change. And that is the initial feeling I have with these eclipses in this lunar total eclipse. What do you think about that, Bradley, the action and change part of things?
Yeah, going off of Jupiter's ingress into Aries, which it's still at the first degree of Aries at this eclipse, for as many things that are happening on the planet right now, and it's easy to focus on a lot of the terrible stuff, because there's a lot of terrible stuff going on. There's still a lot of great stuff going on, and I still get excited about the Aries point, because it's still really this portal of new things coming in. Like I was saying earlier, I think that sometimes it's hard to still have optimism, but what else can we do? We can spiral, and I think with that South Node Moon Scorpio conjunction, some people may go into that place. Like you're spiraling, there's no ground, you're feeling like you're just kind of living in the nightmare. And Jupiter into Aries suggests that something might be coming in. A lot of new things may be coming that haven't actually been here before. We don't know what that is yet. So we're on the cusp of this great portal, so to speak.
It's definitely a portal, because being a total lunar eclipse, of course, means the sun and the moon are aligned with the nodes of the moon. But one of the reasons the Aries point is so powerful is it's often talked about as being, if there is the node of the sun, that's like the node of the sun, because we have the intersection of the sun's, the ecliptic, the path of the sun, which forms our zodiac, intersecting with the celestial equator of the Earth, which is projected out into space. So it's sort of like the fundamental Earth plane of our planet is intersecting with the path of the sun. And so, like the sun's on the north node of the moon, we can almost say, we often think about the Aries point in particular as being like the north node of the sun, because that's where the sun is ascending, especially from the northern hemisphere perspective. It's ascending upwards towards the summer solstice. Jupiter being on the Aries point is making things real. Some things are taking form. There's been a lot of idealism, imagination, vision. All sorts of things could have been seeded by the recent huge Pisces lineup, especially the Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces. Jupiter hitting the Aries point is like, this is getting real. Things are going to take form now. What's really fascinating to me is not only is Jupiter on the Aries point, but Ceres has recently ingressed into Cancer. And so she is at 0 Cancer, which is another one of the cardinal points. So we have a Ceres in Cancer squaring Jupiter in Aries. So we could think about, Ceres is over where the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere happens. Jupiter's at like the spring equinox. Uranus is at 15 degrees of Taurus. That's the midpoint of Jupiter Ceres, sort of where we'd say Beltane or May Day in the northern hemisphere is traditionally. These are like the kind of fundamental, the way the Earth is like set up with the seasons. So it's even more powerful than normal Just for Uranus to be at the midpoint of Jupiter Ceres is pretty impressive, but for them to be at 0 Aries, 0 Cancer, 15 Taurus, that is a massive, something is really coming through with this eclipse. And there's certainly lots of stuff to be upset about and worried about, but especially when we think about what does Ceres and Cancer stand for. We know the story of Ceres and Demeter is also filled with grief, and there's a necessity of being in touch with your grief and letting go and the trauma she goes through in her story. But of course, she's also the earth goddess, and ultimately returns to producing and creating and caring and nurturing. And so I think in terms of taking action to create a more caring community, I mean, it's just really fascinating. They're all right there. I think it's really lined up with that. How do you take the grief and being upset with the way things are, and how do you direct that into real actions in the world?
The Uranus has accelerated things, and I was having this conversation earlier this week with somebody where I was like, in the bigger picture of things, when we were in the 90s, even in the 80s or before that, the writing was on the wall. Like, it's been even earlier, people have been writing sci-fi novels. People have been talking about dystopia future, what was coming down the pike. And we've progressed in this direction. We haven't really fully seen the karma of our actions. Scorpio does correlate with karma. And I'm not saying like this is like the turning point for that, but just in general, the rate of karma, of the consequences of our collective actions on the planet, because like Taurus is Earth, and so I think that there's a larger story here with the Sun conjunct the North Node in Taurus, and then tying that into the Ceres and Cancer is like, how are we going to be stewards? How are we going to take responsibility for our role here to take care of this place and live sustainably? And as we see this acceleration of Earth events, outside of human events, we've got the Earth events, and they just keep happening faster and more dramatic and more extreme. I think honestly, like we're at the acceleration, the tipping point, so to speak. So in a couple years, we may look back and be like, wow, remember when people didn't believe in climate change? Like, it's so obvious now that it's so accelerated. We've got the call now, and we can go into despair. We can go into give up, and those emotions are there. And I'm not saying they're not valid, but I think the call is always to be like, let's get it together and let's see what resources we have to turn this around. I mean, what else can we do?
After listening to both of what you just said, there's an interesting thing here, what I believe in with Uranus and Taurus, as in, obviously, there's the revolutionary aspect of Uranus and the rebellion and the need for change. But I mentioned this before on another podcast, that maybe that change actually is to get back to the root of who we are and as human beings and our connection to nature. And to reintegrate our senses, to come back to that. I could say this to what you said, Gray, about these cardinal points, which are initiatory points in the zodiac, right? Things build up, we have a vision, and things must change, just like the seasons must change. And then, Bradley, you're talking about, the Earth story and reflected back to us. It mirrors back to us, and we mirror the Earth story. So this tension and conflict and a lot of these emotions that we've been going through in this acceleration, it is mirrored by nature. And it comes back to us, it mirrors back to us. And so I don't think of it as quick or as black and white, a polarity of how things change. Our sorrow and sadness overlaps with wanting to make change. And that story and that ritual, I think, is important. If I were to look at the south node of this eclipse and what it is in Scorpio, something needs to be thrown away. Something needs to be cut off and done. Something needs to be, quote unquote, die, in a sense, for something to move forward. So we have a multi-layered thing here showing us different things about how to deal with pain and suffering and trauma, and at the same time feeling like you can do something with that and transform and move forward. Again, looking at the South Node in Scorpio, the North Node in Taurus, I think it's important to look at the rulers of the ruler of Scorpio, which is Mars, and the ruler of the sun in Taurus, Venus. And I think it's a major part of this lunation. And it's been Venus and Mars story here for the last 6 months with many of the lunations. So when it comes to the Scorpio South Node, we're going to look at the ruler. And the ruler's Mars in Pisces at 23 degrees. Now on paper, technically, it's trining the 22 degrees, trining both nodes. There's something there that taking action with the dream is there. It's something there, but it's still muted, right? It's still not quite there, but it's building. If I go look to see where the planetary ruler is of Taurus, Venus, now this is what's really interesting to me, is because it's conjunct Chiron and Aries. And see, here's the wound exposed. And how long can you walk around with the wound? And how long do you deal with that wound until you have to do something with it? Heal it, patch it up, make it evolve, turn it into something. What do you guys think about what I just said about Mars and Venus?
I'll start with the Mars side, and then so Mars is in Pisces. It's conjunct Neptune in Pisces. So you're talking about this Scorpio South Node as something needs to be let go, something needs to die. So, I mean, speaking of letting go, I mean, what says letting go more than Mars conjunct Neptune in Pisces? I mean, it's just dissolve, compost, just kind of let it go. And with that because it isn't a trine to the South Node in the Moon, there is a potential ease to let things dissolve and let go at this time. It could be very cathartic, very powerful. On the flip side of that, I just wanted to say that it also could be very easy to do the opposite of that. If you're still holding on, then that Mars conjunct Neptune in Pisces is like blame game, victimhood. We start to spiral into these negative aspects, the escapism. So you're still holding on. So then what do? You just like disassociate, you check out, you escape, you blame others. So it's also going to be easy to do that. And so what we need to do really is we need to turn to that North Node in the ruler Venus and say, how does this paint us a path forward right now?
Yeah, I like that because you're right. The Mars, Neptune can be someone feeling like a victim or martyring themselves, or can also be something becomes very dogmatic, crusading. I think about that a lot with the Mars and Neptune, the kind of really self-righteous, overly idealistic kind of crusader telling everybody the way they need to be, or all the grief and anger that's out there around what's going on can definitely be directed in that way. But I think, right, the Mars Neptune trining that is in one way inviting how to take that pain and like you're saying, directing it somehow outside yourself into how to help those in your personal life that need the support, people in your community, in this bigger sort of in a way more aligned with spirit, in a way, having that help uplift you through this difficult period that we're passing through. And in that same way, Venus and Aries with Chiron, that's definitely speaking in some ways to how far out of alignment with nature we become, the divisiveness, the polarization. But Venus with Chiron in Aries is actually incredibly resilient, enduring, will really fight through anything. It'll fight for love. It'll fight for beauty. I actually think about Venus and Aries. I have Venus and Aries. We'll fight for what's beautiful. We fight for what we love. We fight for what, insisting on that in a way, and willing to take action. And so with Jupiter also in Aries, there's this, just real influx of that Aries energy. Hopefully there's a way to find the way forward through this, because I think there's a lot of potential, like you're saying, for despair at this time.
Those words of abundance and the confidence, with Jupiter and Aries there, how it can carries one flame or reignite one's own personal flame. That's what the story is here with this transit for the rest of the year, wherever Aries is in your chart, of how you stand for yourself and how you put yourself out there, and the story and the wisdom that comes from doing it over and over again, your self-esteem, your self-confidence, and putting yourself in the world. the importance of this is if we were on a political angle, you know, we can already see things building up. Let's say you mentioned something with the Roe versus Wade scenario that's happening right now, and it's about to be summertime in the Northern Hemisphere, and it always kicks off protests. There's a history of this. You could see this happening on a political level. And there's wounds connected to this too, and how one person and how they group together in culture and how they deal with something like this. So hugely important, all of this. But let us not forget, though, something very important here that's happening in this chart too, and it's Saturn in Aquarius, and it's squaring this lunation and squaring the nodes. We've been talking about trines and some certain other things, but then we have Saturn here. It just almost seems like it's coldly hanging out, just coldly sitting there, you know, and squaring this. And we know what squares are for those who are learning astrology. Squares is a squaring out point. It's 90-degree aspect. It's like two cars going through a stop sign at the same time and creating tension in a situation where something crashes and must be changed. It's at a fundamental point, a square. And so Saturn's here with this. And I'm curious, Bradley, like what you think about this from the way you study astrology and what you deal with the nodes and Saturn. How do you feel about this?
I feel like I would kind of reverse what I just said before, because I mean, not totally, but with the Saturn square to the node, the Scorpio South node is the resolution node. As much as it's the North node's in Taurus, the Sun's in Taurus, we do want to focus on Taurus themes. But with the Scorpio South node being the resolution node, we kind of go back to the Mars as the traditional ruler of that Scorpio South node conjunct Neptune and say, you know, what does that mean? And what are the healthy, positive expressions of a Mars in Pisces? Yeah, fighting for a cause, fighting for something much greater than one individual is, for something that's collective. In the healthy Pisces sense, Pisces is consciousness itself, the desire to be conscious, even though it's painful, even though we're pissed off. The desire to transcend, of course, is another Mars Pisces thing. When things get really ugly in life, we look for something that inspires us that's much greater than the moment. You know, something to, if you've given up on all hope for humanity in this moment, what lens can you approach life to have some inspiration, some hope? Yeah, I mean, I feel like we don't even need to speak to the negative aspects of this and the rise of opioids and I know, yeah, we know that's happening. We know people are going to be checking out. We know it hurts. I think that there's a little bit of that, you know, find your inspiration in this. And what is that?
I'm just noticing another midpoint, not quite as exact as the one I was speaking of to earlier, but Pluto in Capricorn is sort of, I mean, if you give it a little bit of a wide orb, a few degrees at least, is sort of around roughly the midpoint of the Mars Neptune and the Moon with the South node, because their Mars Neptune is basically sextiling Pluto, and the Moon in Scorpio is also sextiling Pluto, and after Mars conjoins Neptune a few days after the eclipse, it will sextile Pluto. So I think that Pluto, which has been such a big player in everything that's been going on this year, is also interestingly lurking in the shadows there, but in an actually very integrative place with this eclipse. Pluto's not really making any hard aspects. It's trining the Sun in the North node, it's sextiling the South node and the Moon, it's sextiling Mars, Neptune, the ruler of the nodes, and it's averse to Saturn. I think that just really plays into what you were just talking about, Bradley, and what Nicholas was saying earlier about just sort of the putrefaction, the death, the need to grieve, let go. Saturn squaring those just does not mean this is something that's going to be fast. You know, dealing with loss that leads to ultimately, you know, transformation and growth. It's a slow process. Sort of that loss and shedding, you know, sort of ends up feeding the growth that comes out of it. I think Saturn is, of course, the ultimate planet for that sort of deep sort of death, kind of alchemical loss that turns into greater fortitude and strength over time. I think Saturn being in Aquarius, squaring this, is ultimately about, needing to take the time to really be in your integrity of your highest integrity. It's really calling for that. There's some necessary sacrifices that happen in order to be in your integrity out of this time period.
Since we're still here on this chart and we're looking at a degree here of this lunation, it's 25 degrees and some change, right? And before we started this podcast, we were talking about different things behind the scenes. We were talking about certain aspects. We were talking about the rest of this month, what's going to happen with Mercury in Gemini and the retrograde cycle. Mercury was in Taurus at 26 degrees. And that was the beginning of
April 26th.
April 26th. Thank you. April 26th at 26 degrees Taurus. And it was the beginning of the shadow phase. And then we get into May 10th, and Mercury is at the 4 degrees Gemini, and it starts to go backwards. It starts to go retrograde. And then later, 3 weeks down the line, Mercury stops stops going backwards to move forwards, and it stops at 26 degrees Taurus, which is pretty much the point here where this lunation is. So I don't want to forget Mercury's role actually in all of this, because I think it's connected. And I think too of how we think about things, how we are used to going from point A to point B in our worlds, how we formulate our words, our thoughts and opinions, and the way we communicate is under recalibration here for the rest of the month and connected to this lunation, in my opinion, because I'm looking at degrees that are getting touched and repeated on. So I'm trying to bring this Mercury thing back in here with you guys. and I think that's important because of how we walk and function in the world every day, and how we get from point A to point B in our minds, how we send an email, what we're seeing on our computer and phone screens, what's coming at us too. There's that part of all this and how we process that. So I don't know what y'all think about that. You have a little something to say to something like that?
Yeah, what's interesting is right at this eclipse, Mercury is entering its phase of combustion. At least for those, I know some people are not in total agreement. If you use the 8-degree threshold for combustion, Mercury is like right at that threshold.
And when you say combustion, Gray, give us a quick definition to that in case people...
So when a planet's within 8 degrees of the sun, it's so close to the sun, it's combust because of being so close under those beams of the sun. Not only can you not see it, but especially in this case with Mercury moving backwards towards the sun, it's heading into the sun, which means Mercury's at the end of a cycle. In this case, Mercury is at the end of being an evening star phase planet. We no longer can see it, so we can say that Mercury has descended into the underworld, and we can't see it anymore. A lot of times the metaphor that Demeter George popularizes, Mercury taking on its like psychopomp role of like guiding our souls into the underworld. But it's in Gemini, so it's in its own sign. It's actually a very powerful Mercury. It's about the best case condition for a planet to be when it is combust. Incredible facility, curiosity, dexterity, Quicksilver dancing around, making all these connections that Gemini has. Mercury and Gemini has really slowed down here. It's really intensified. This is like the really deep Gemini quality that can really probe and penetrate under the surface of things and really gain some powerful insights. It's about less than a week after the eclipse. May 21st is when Mercury will actually be in the heart of the sun, and that's when Mercury is sort of purified and reanimated and reborn, and we'll have some probably greater clarity coming out of it. But it's very fascinating that Mercury is often involved in plot twists and changes in stories, and he's very much in kind of perfect position here to help us, and that means being Mercury and Gemini, you want to pay attention to signs and dreams and synchronicities. Let that sort of intuitive knowing help guide you through, this like very liminal time period that we're in here.
Also noticing when Mercury does go retrograde and then reaches the conjunction with the sun, it's forming that sextile to Jupiter. it's kind of like, as much as Jupiter goes into Aries and we're at the gates and we're ready to go, it's also like, well, and we're kind of not going forward necessarily. There's going to be a lot of clues, I think, that are going to provide a lot of like seeds and opportunity. You know, we're just going to get little seeds planted, and by the time Mars goes into Aries and Mercury stations direct, I think that a lot of this is going to tie together as we go through this period. I did want to shift gears a smidge and just throw this out there. The degree that Mercury comes back to 26 Taurus, and the degree the sun's at now, 25 and some change, is really close to the fixed star ALGOL. And I have very little experience using fixed stars, but it just kind of came to me just before we started this. It's got a bad reputation, It's intense. And the fact that that's ruled by that Venus in Aries conjunct Chiron, there's positives, but I think there's going to be some pretty ugly stuff, to be honest. I'm looking to you two for some insight on. It's like, okay, we know that this is historically correlated with violence and tragedy. Seeing that everything that's going on, and there's so much. We never had to live in this reality where we knew everything that was going on in the world. Not that we know everything, but it's a different way of living, Like, we didn't evolve with news of 20 different tragedies and crises that are so extreme that it's mind-blowing, and that's like our morning coffee. Like, it's a different world that we're living in today than 30 years ago, especially for the evolution of the whole species. So how does our consciousness even process the world as it exists today? And I just say this coming into where this may correlate with some pretty more intense stuff, and we see that Pisces, and it's like, yeah, checking out is one way to go. Fighting for what we believe is another way to go. We're going to see both things going on. I don't know, what other thoughts do you have about this inspirational take?
To me, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning with that ALGOL being involved, the difficult current events happening, collective events happening, and the potential for just rage and anger and grief and the total lunar eclipse in the south node is really pointing the need to how are you processing that. In some cases, there might need to be just a focus on rest and restoration. In other cases, really, channeling that into something, whether that's putting it into your art, activity, exercise, whatever it might be. So I think that's a real just kind of coping mechanism that's going to be needed, rather than, like you're saying, just like totally checking out. In some cases, we all need some diversions and distractions, so not like that's not something you don't do, but just in terms of
right, yeah,
long term, coming out of this, we need to find ways to process what's going on.
Gotta give
so it's a very difficult looking eclipse with a chart, but it's one of those things where it's when you look at a chart like this and how the things we're pointing out that on one hand look challenging, difficult, it's also the kind of thing like this changes everything. When the state of the world is as bad as it is, this changing everything, there's a silver lining there, because we don't want things to stay the way they are.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to know more about ALGOL, there's a website called Constellation of Words, and they have definition of all the fixed stars. I just went to go look it up really quick, and some of the words here is unfortunate, violent, and dangerous star in the heavens. And so it has this history about it. And, it could be, too, with a Mercury station at that degree that, got to watch your tongue, too, a little bit, right? Some of what can come out of your vocal cords can be brutal and to the point and cutting, and I think, too, with endings and beginnings with the lunation and the intensity of things in the middle of a retrograde, it's good to take a step back, too, with how you communicate and what's your intention behind your words and the messages that you have. To go back to how we started talking about this, and we're bringing, Mercury, eventually when Mercury stations on May 30th goes forward, within a couple days there, we have a new moon in Gemini, which Mercury rules that lunation. Around June 18th, Mercury gets to 4 degrees, where it was when it first went retrograde on May 10th. And then after that, it actually aspects, eventually, it's going to aspect Saturn in Aquarius, which is at 24 degrees, and it's also going to aspect Neptune in Pisces, 24 degrees around that area. So even when the retrograde's officially done, these lunations are done, Mercury is still touching upon the points here in this lunar total eclipse that we first started talking about. And so this is how we like to make connections in the astrology world. If you think about things as chapters of a story, of an ongoing story, you always find Mercury in the middle of all this, by the way, kind of going back to what you said, Gray, as this trickster and moving the story on, and this little, the beacon is out in the front, leading it, in a sense, neutrally. And if you were to take on the Hermes archetype, just for the fun of it, if you want to think about it that way, but Mercury's definitely part of this. In and out, going to that place you mentioned earlier, burning down to its purity with the sun, and then coming back out and playing its role in all this. We talked a lot about this lunar eclipse. I don't know how you want to kind of finish this. I can start. If we think about the last 6 to 8 months and go all the way back to the first Scorpio Taurus eclipse that happened in November, and we went through a Venus retrograde. Then we have a serious amount of Pisces planets, and Venus and Mars have been pretty much integrated with all the lunations since then. And here we are now. For me, the change is inevitable this month with the Jupiter in Aries, with the eclipses bringing change, Mars and Aries coming in, the Mercury story that we talked about. So on my end, I like to tell people that whether you're ready for it or not, get ready, because things are shifting and there's no going back to the past. And whatever tools that you have and whatever types of support systems you have, access them. Ritualize them. Time to move forward. It's hard, but there are tools out there. Go to yourself, your intuition, your light, and your heart to move through this. So that's what I am kind of summing up. What about you, Bradley? What do you...
I'm feeling you on that. I mean, where is our inspiration? And connecting with spirit, whatever your own personal sense of something greater than self is. If you're atheist, maybe it's connecting with a cause. A lot of times that's how people can do something. It's like service is a path where we get out of our own spiral, so to speak. I think also just because things are so intense and there's so much pressure that we put on ourselves in the modern era, and life's so complicated. Pisces and Taurus are two signs that remind us to keep things simple. As much as we want to do the right thing or fight for the cause that we believe in, we got to give ourselves breaks. So it's going to be, I agree, there's no going back. I do think it's the 2020s alone. I just like this whole decade is just going to be like, you get used to chaos, get used to disruption. Like this is the new norm. Like the pandemic being over, like there's no going back to how things were before at this point for a lot of reasons.
Accelerate the next years ahead.
So be gentle with ourselves, be loving, go to the heart, check in with yourself, and just figure out what you got to do. What do you think, Gray?
I want to affirm your message of keeping it simple and taking care of yourself, because one of the things, Jupiter going to Aries, this is a thing where, Jupiter was in a sign where it was about, Jupiter in Pisces was about kind of slowing things down, really sinking into things, feeling things deeply. Jupiter in Aries is going to pick up the pace. Things are going to start moving faster. We already referenced earlier, Mars is not coming too far behind. Mars is going to things are going to start eventually moving faster, and things are going to be speeding up here. Yeah, just doing what you can to take care of yourself during this time and keeping it as simple as possible.
Well, I think we ended that on a pretty good note, actually. We're all talking positive. There's a way through and a way out, and support systems and inspiration and so on and so forth. Thanks for jumping on the podcast, you guys. Bradley, where can people find you?
BradleyNaragon.com. That's Naragon. And I've got links to all my stuff. I've got a YouTube channel on social media. I've got an online store. Excited to be at the Northwest Astrology Conference at the end of the month.
So I was going to say, if anybody that's listening to this is going to be at NORWAC, you want to look for Bradley's art stand where he sells all his astrology arts and crafts, sometimes dressed as Hermes, but I'm not sure if that's happening this year or not. And my site is graycrawford.net, as I mentioned before.
You can find myself and anything about me at sparklesofgold.com. I have a YouTube channel. I'm on TikTok. Find me on TikTok, if you can believe this. Instagram. I have a Pinterest page. I'm all in on this, and there's my podcast. I also do one-on-one readings, as we all do, all the astrologers here. You can contact me through the website. Any other questions? There's no dumb, stupid questions. If you can contact me, like, what does this mean, Nicholas? What is that? I'll either tell you the answer or point you to a website to learn more about astrology. Thanks for joining us on this special episode, and until next time, be well.